Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear students, it's my pleasure to talk about genome editing and preimplantation genetic diagnosis. What I like to do with you is I like to use the transformation which CRISPR has provided of a bacterial defense system into powerful genome editing tools for eukaryotic cells, which radically changes molecular genetic research, biotechnology, and biomedicine to reflect on this from the position of an ethicist. This new technology makes human gene therapy and human gene enhancement a more realistic possibility, especially gene therapy at the moment. And what I like to do is, in the first place, to reveal my ethical framework. I think it's very important that we have a lot of very different ethical approaches around the world, that you know where I start from. And what I will leave out is any theological argument. So argument from we shouldn't be creators like God or so, I will skip. I will just focus on philosophical ethical framework. And then I will give my understanding of preimplantation genetic diagnosis, human gene therapy, and human gene enhancement, and comparing the ethical challenges of PGD and genetic interventions by giving an ethical evaluation. What we can say on a political sphere is that we have all around the world a kind of common overlapping consensus concerning dignity and rights in the great documents of the world, of the United Nations and other organizations and bodies, Global Compact in business ethics and other things, UNESCO, bioethics, and similar things. And human dignity here is a principle of respecting every human being as a subject on its own. That means it is very important to consider that every human being is equal, independent of race, gender, religion, political belief, economic or social condition, which means we can't be sacrificed for any means any other person or any state thinks so important that he wants to sacrifice one of us. So fundamental rights are linked to the concept of human dignity, and important for our question is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization stating the attainment of the highest standard of health defined as complete physical, mental, and social well-being is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So a freedom to decide on issues of health and well-being and respecting the freedom and well-being of others are very much linked as well to the concept of dignity as it's understood by the United Nations and other bodies. What I don't do here, which is very important, we have some from the field of jurisprudence here, I don't tackle the issue how the German fundamental law is interpreting human dignity. If you have this kind of concept of human dignity, it's very much linked to an understanding of justice and well-being. If there is a right to attain the highest standard of health defined as complete physical, mental, and social well-being, then there is a duty to work on a common worldwide framework to help to build a just society which helps to attain this standard. However, duty and the superlative highest shall not be understood in an absolute sense, but as a goal society as a whole should aim at, in a difference to, for example, utilitarian thinking, which I give you on this slide to make the difference between two great ethical frameworks. In utilitarian thinking, you have a kind of duty to maximize the happiness of the greatest number of beings, capable of preferences, and you state the equality of equal preferences, but this kind of duty may sacrifice once in a while a person for maximizing the happiness of the greatest number. If we take the framework by human dignity instead, we have a kind of focus on a good life in the meaning of well-being and basic rights. So we focus on a good life for human beings according to their will, and that means what they choose to be a good life. Self-determination excluded a paternalistic or objectivistic approach. It is not necessary to realize fixed standards of objective criteria. Self-determination presupposes well-being as necessary condition of possibility. So an acknowledgement of dignity and basic rights. And as well, the second implication in this kind of ethical framework I provide is justice as fairness. You see how it's linked to the concept of justice by John Rawls. It means fair chances of everybody or for everybody to live a good life. Inequality should be allowed only if they do not hurt the basic rights and needs of everybody. Here you see a kind of difference to the Rawlsian framework. So you don't need to respect in every decision that it has to help the worst off, but it needs to respect the basic rights and needs. And the basic rights and needs of everybody are limiting the right of self-determination. That is, in a nutshell, what I am starting from when I now try to compare genome editing and preimplantation genetic diagnosis. We had it this morning. I just repeated in a sentence what is preimplantation genetic diagnosis, a form of diagnosis of the genome of embryos prior to implantation, sometimes even of oocytes prior to fertilization, requiring in vitro fertilization to obtain oocytes or embryos for evaluation. And the important thing is you may structure PGD according to a lot of possible applications. And what I just want to give you on this slide is a diagnosis to discover mutations of genes causing fetal diseases. And you can distinguish between fetal diseases before birth and shortly after birth. So some families in all countries over the world have a lot of abortions, spontaneous abortions during pregnancy, so the women, because there is a defect, a mutation in the genes, very often translocations, so they die before birth. Because what you saw this morning, you saw a slide with a karyogram of a human being, the 46 chromosomes, and if one piece of one chromosome is practically translocated to another chromosome, the result of it is that the person with this translocation has a good life, but the child afterwards is in 50, 75% of the cases missing one piece or has one piece too much, and this leads to death even before birth. Or there are chromosomal differences like chromosome 15, where every embryo is dying when the organs are developing, so in the second, third month. Then shorter after birth, and you have a diagnosis to discover mutations of genes causing severe diseases starting before birth, like mucoviscidosis, or later in life, like chorea Huntington, or what we saw this morning, Duchenne, starting very early. So this is mutations with severe diseases. Then you could discover genes causing abnormalities, like that you are very short or very big, large. So this is different. And then diagnosis to discover mutations of genes causing certain preferred traits. As far as I know, some organizations, sports organizations, are using this tool to find out whether someone has the ability to be a good sprinter, a good sportsman in a certain sports environment. And one of my co-workers at my institute, now is a professor on a different university, his daughter was elected to go to Berlin, and after a year she was sent back because she had developed physically in a way that she was not for dancing so ballet and all this, not possible to have a good career, and this school just includes persons who have this kind of career. So we have a kind of way of choosing people even in this country. And then there is a possibility to diagnose, to discover certain traits helpful for a sibling in need, for example, treating leukemia, which is very often used not very often, but it's used in the United Kingdom as well in the United States. So you see where PGD fits and is possible to be used. And then you have genetic interventions, a physiological, cognitive, or behavioral therapy or risk prevention for diseases or improvement of human faculties by means of methods of gene technology, that is, using gene technology for therapeutic and non-therapeutic purposes, and if used to improve physiological, cognitive, or behavioral human traits or characteristics, a genetic intervention is called human genetic enhancement. What's clear, and I don't deal with it here, is we have a large problem of a gray zone. So we have some use of gene technology, easy to classify a therapy like substitution therapy with human insulin produced by transgenic bacteria, or somatic gene therapy for SCID. But some use, which is easily to classify as enhancement, for example, if you would use this technology for changing normal seeing or producing a human eye that can see in the dark. I just use science fiction example to make it clear. But the problem is, for example, the alteration of a short-statured person's height. Therapy, is it therapy or is it enhancement? We had the case that a couple of lesbian people, women, they wanted to have, because they were themselves deaf, they wanted by PGD, use PGD to have a child which is deaf as well, like they are. So you see the problem of this gray zone. And if I make this practically to make clear, you have 4 cases you should distinguish: clear cases of therapy, prevention of diseases, engineering against risk factors or non-digressions, and clear cases of enhancement, which you can distinguish between physiological, cognitive, or behavioral. And I just want to explain from the clear cases of enhancement the physiological part. Theoretically, and for clear cases of therapy as well, the physiological part. Theoretically, mucoviscidose can be healed by somatic gene therapy, introducing the missing protein, so introducing the genes coding for the amino acids, which then are responsible for this protein. And what we saw this morning in colleague Hübner's talk was like this tool can be used for a disease like Duchenne. But we could use it for physiological enhancement in sports as well. There exist synthetic genes producing high amounts of naturally occurring muscle-building hormones, can last for years. You can use it for treat muscle wasting disorders, so therapeutically, but you may use it to enhance the muscle-building capacity in sports as well. So this is under the label of gene doping, one possibility. And the good thing in this, from a point of scientists, is that you have a lot of people willing, healthy people willing to use this kind of tool to improve their physiological possibilities. And this is the kind of people you need if you want to go forward with a kind of genetic intervention. And then there is a possibility of enhancing the lifespan enhancement in the worm C. elegans, for example, provided this worm with 4 times the lifespan than normally. And because we are, in a way, we have common ancestors with the worm C. elegans 800 million years ago. Interestingly, this part of our genes and the genes in the C. elegans are very near, so we can heal with our genes practically worm C. elegans who has a defect in a certain trait. They can use our gene sequence and heal this worm. So it may be possible that we could use this kind of technology to enlarge our lifespan as well. And that does not mean that we have 300 years as a very old person, but all our development would change, and we would have, if everything goes well, 400, let's say 200 good years, if possible. So that's just to give an impression what may be possible. And then we could make a different kind of distinguishment. We could distinguish between genetic interventions by the method, so using drugs genetically engineered, or by the direct method by somatic gene treatment or germline intervention. And if we do a kind of comparing PGD and gene intervention in an ethical evaluation, one thing which is very important in the discussion is, for a lot of countries, the status of the early embryo, which is a question of ontology. It's not an ethical question. It's a question how you understand the early embryo. If you believe that the early embryo is a person like we are, then it has the same rights under the umbrella of human dignity as every other person in the world. So if you destroy an embryo for research, it would be morally the same thing as destroying a born human being for research. But it's an ontological decision you did. You said, I believe that an early embryo is a human person. This kind of decision is taken by large organizations in this world, like the Roman Catholic Church with more than 1 billion adherents. If you believe a human person, an early embryo is a human person, you could allow PGD if the discarding of the embryo would be in a way analogous to passive euthanasia. You could say, okay, to implant this kind of embryo is the same as passive euthanasia. If a child is born with a fetal condition, very often physicians ask the parents, should we make maximum therapy or should we just make a kind of palliative care and let the born child go away as quickly as possible. If we do all operations, maybe it will live 2 weeks, 3 weeks time, 1 month, sometimes 3 months. And genetic interventions would be only allowed if they do not destroy embryos. What we heard today was that it seems to be impossible at the moment just to heal one early embryo. So we could imagine to use IVF just to fertilize one egg, then make a diagnosis. We discover this embryo has a Duchenne condition, and then we repair it. That would be possible if this is possible, and you would respect the human person with human dignity in this kind of case, just theoretically. The other question, whether you may be allowed to use in vitro fertilization, is a different question I don't want to tackle with, but the position of some philosophers who influenced very much the Roman Catholic Church is that you never are allowed to divide the act of procreation from the act of sexual intercourse. If you don't believe that the early embryo is a human being in a human person, but you believe it's a human being in development without dignity and basic rights, then from the status of the early embryo, PGD seems to be allowed for all respective cases I mentioned earlier. And genetic interventions should be allowed for all respected cases as well. Just from the point of view of the embryo. If he has no basic rights, it's a balancing of goods, and if there is good reasons to say we try it for a sibling, you should do. So in a way, the British legislation to allow this seems to be very well in this line of thinking. They don't believe that the early embryo is a human person. Therefore, they allow that you create it, use PGD, you discard 10, you use the 2 who have the condition to help the sibling. If you look not on the status of the embryo, but on self-determination, then you can distinguish decision of parents from decision of groups in the society and from decisions of state authorities. If you believe this is practically just a philosophical and not a political question, no, it is, because we have in some countries groups, for example, in New York, some conservative groups of Jews where the rabbi expects a couple that they give their DNA, and if the testing is a testing which says both are carriers of Tay-Sachs disease, which is very often in Jews in New York, then he says, God has not given you two for a marriage. You have to go your own way. You should not marry. So this is reality in this world. It's not something invented by philosophers. By decision of parents, you know, it is done for fetal diseases, severe diseases, for abnormalities as well, for siblings as well, for preferred traits. We saw that it is in the publicity, so it seems to be an option for people in this world. And the decision of state authorities is far away, and only if we use PGD by decision of state authorities, the name of eugenics would be, according to the terminology of Galton, the right terminology, or the terminology of Plato in his great work, The State. Then we would have a kind of the state decides, the philosopher king decides what is the preferred traits we wanted to continue, and he would say that should be done. It gets complicated more and more if we look at self-determination and genetic interventions. It's just, I don't explain everything. I just want to give you a map to understand why it's so important to see how many cases you have to distinguish if you want to think about it. And if you are lazy to think about it, then you make a moratorium not thinking about anything. Or you say, I make a moratorium thinking about everything, and you should do it by case. You won't be ending, never ever, because you can be of different opinion on any of these cases. You could say, I don't allow it for fetal diseases because I'm convinced, so someone could say, in vitro fertilization is all wrong, and then you can't do it. So what is important to see, you could do it by the individual, so for somatic gene therapy, for fetal diseases, severe diseases. You could use it for prevention of diseases, for siblings, for enhancement. You could do it for the same cases by decision of parents, and they could do it for a later embryo, so for the individual or for their child, or they could do it in the germline for generations to come. The same by decision of groups in the society or state authorities. All these cases are very interesting. Why do I give you this kind of map? I give it to you to compare it with a different map, the map of education. And you could use education by your own decision. You came here hopefully for a kind of cognitive improvement, maybe for improvement of behavior. I don't believe for a physiological improvement, because normally it's not so good for your back to stay in the chair. But it's your decision whether you go here or not. If it's a decision of parents, they could do it for the individual, for physiological improvement, cognitive improvement, and improvement of behavior. It could be the decision of groups in the society, or like in Germany, by decision of state authorities, which give you a duty, you have a duty to go to school. So they force upon you the decision in education. That's just to mention that we have cases where the state authorities force you to do something because they believe it's good for your child, even though they should know that most children, after going to school, have changed their physiological behavior, and before they went to school, they were very upright, sitting in their chairs, and when they leave school, they normally sit so. I can discover it in in many cases. My two daughters are good examples for it. So just to mention, there are decisions which the state does in education. But interestingly, we have an overlapping consensus in respect to education to say human dignity includes a fundamental right to education, and the state has a duty to provide education, and even a consensus that the state has a right to enforce the child's right to education, even against the will of the parents. And then there are differences between a lot of states. So some states allow to do it at your home, other states don't allow it to you. If this overlapping consensus, we should look now in respect to reversible indirect or somatic gene interventions, we could ask, why is there no consensus that human dignity includes a fundamental right to a reversible indirect or somatic gene intervention? Why is there no consensus that the state has a duty to provide a reversible indirect or somatic gene intervention for all its citizens? And why is there no consensus that the state has a right to enforce the child's right to a reversible indirect or somatic genetic intervention if we practically all agree, benefiting and risks balanced, that it's good for our children? That is a very important question to ask. I ask it here, I don't answer anything at this moment. I just want to say it's very important to see this. And one reason could say that we say presently reversible indirect or somatic genetic intervention seems to involve risks for the person involved. Therefore, there is a risk evaluation case by case needed, and therefore people should not be forced into procedures they think risky for themselves. But it seems to me that there is no good reason that people could freely choose even genetic enhancement if the risk-benefit analysis is favorable, if only risks are the issue. I mean, that is for the individual, that I decide I want to do it. Why shouldn't it be allowed to me if this reasoning is sound? And the question for a further ethical evaluation would be, the more distant the decision is from the individual, the more the autonomy of the respective individual now and in the future is at stake. Therefore, the state should not enforce genetic intervention on its people. However, what if practically all agree that a specific form of genetic intervention is good for everybody now and forever and practically free of risks? Then we would, the reasoning from the World Health Organization, we would have an improvement of well-being, an improvement of health in this complete sense, and thereby enlargement of the dimension of autonomy. Yeah, that is not an enlargement like by Habermas. Habermas, that's a different concept here, but this is possibilities, more possibilities. Another reason against this possibility is genetic intervention violates justice, and the fundamental argument is from Lindy, who says, does justice require that wealthy individuals spend their excess money on bigger houses, faster cars, and more luxurious vacations instead of enhancements to improve verbal comprehension, for example? Or does justice require wealthy persons to spend their money on normal education? So you could ask whether genetic intervention, even genetic enhancement, should not be treated differently from opportunities in education as long as freedom and well-being of others is respected. But maybe know the consequences. That is the main problem, that we have no concept of real improvement. So Winnaker, the former president of the German Research Organization, asked the question, is affirmative in it, that he says, it is absolutely unclear which form of intelligence or social behavioral patterns are advantageous in the future. For such interventions, no common or scientific reasons or criteria could be applied. Again, this is not a reason against somatic gene enhancement, but only against germline enhancement. And as a result, we could say somatic gene enhancement should be allowed if the respective individual wants to do it for itself. And then we could see whether there is a kind of misuse of this opportunity, and we may prohibit something like we prohibit some kinds of drugs, thinking it's not good for the person, even if the person decides on its own. If it's a self-determination of the future child, we could say if we distinguish between PGD and genetic intervention into germline, we should allow it for diseases, although the embryo with the mutation is discarded. So you see my kind of ontological decision not to grant full moral status to the early embryo, and it should be an open question for all other purposes. And genetic intervention into the germline should be allowed for diseases only if the risks are not higher than the risk of PGD, although the embryo with the mutation is saved. So here it is, because I don't believe that the early embryo is a human being with human dignity in its fullness. So it's not a human being with human dignity and human rights. Then the risk evaluation has a very high importance, and you should use the method which is risk-freer, and that is PGD. And genetic interventions should be only or allowed only if benefiting the child, and this is the problem we had earlier in this slide. We have no common ground at the moment what's truly benefiting the children. And I will end with the germline editing, which poses many important issues, and any of these issues would give us a possibility to talk about it half an hour, so I just want to conclude with this slide. The risk of inaccurate editing and incomplete editing of the cells of early stage embryos is at the moment the reason why we could use it. At the moment we can't use it in a therapy on a regular basis. But what should be allowed is to use it in some cases for research purposes if people agree on it. The difficulty of predicting harmful effects that genetic changes may have under the wide range of circumstances experienced by the human population, including interactions with other genetic variants and with the environment, and the obligation to consider implications for both the individual and the future generations who will carry the genetic alterations. The fact that once introduced into the human population, genetic alterations would be difficult to remove and would not remain within any single community or country. So we should look at this fact and should question us whether there are means to, in a way, make this not a huge risk, and the possibility that permanent genetic enhancements to subsets of the population could exacerbate social inequities or be used coercively. So what I try to explain with my slide on justice is that we have to really focus on this question, but in a broader, a deeper understanding what we understand by justice, whether we have the ability to provide practically anyone with this opportunity or not, and what we do if someone does not want to use this opportunity. Because what we can see from other technologies, if someone actively is not willing to use a new technology, he has a lot of disadvantages in the society very often. And then the moral and ethical consideration in purposefully altering human evolution using this kind of technology, so germline interventions for human gene enhancement. All these are very, very important questions. For example, the last one, we had a kind of insight today how many people are thinking about 40, 30 years ago. They started to think about it very carefully. There was a cyber conference in the 60s where they had a huge conference of scientists just focusing on these kind of questions. Even Galton, and if we go back to Plato, it's a very, very long history of thinking about these questions. So I give them to you, and I'm looking forward to listening to your questions. Thank you for your attention.